Happy Valentine's Day and welcome into our weekly program of conversation. We call it Moral Side of the News. We're glad you're alongside. I'm John Blim with the WHAS Crusade for Children. With us, as usual, a distinguished panel this week, Dr. Marian Taylor, South Frankfort Presbyterian Church, Rabbi Emeritus Stan Miles, Temple Shalom, Father Joe Graffis, Archdiocese of Louisville, and we welcome a new member to our panel this week, Reverend David Harkleroad, South Point Church, New Albany. Welcome, David.
Thank you.
Our first topic, the historic second impeachment trial of former President Donald Trump is underway. The charge is incitement of insurrection. The Senate upheld its constitutionality after 6 Republicans voted with Democrats. Arguments and evidence will be presented by both the former president's lawyers and the House managers prosecuting the case. So we turn to our panel on Moral Side of the News and some questions. What are you expecting, and is it unfolding like you thought? Who'd like to start?
Since it's Valentine's Day, I'm thinking about the words of the Backrack David song, and I agree. What the world needs now is love, sweet love. I found watching the trial to be horrifying and terrifying, particularly the evidence from the video cameras. The first video, the 14-minute video put together by the prosecution was, I think, a media masterpiece. But on the second day of the trial on Wednesday, when they showed the raw footage from the security cameras throughout the Capitol during the insurrection, I can understand why the folks who were trapped in the Capitol felt that their life was over, and they were making peace with their maker, and they were making peace with their families. And thank God that more people were not killed. It cannot happen again. You cannot have a mob going hunting for human beings in the most sacred public space in the United States of America.
I think I agree with you, Stan. What I saw of both days and the videos were incredibly disturbing and powerful. Unfortunately, with all of this, while you say it's a trial, it's really neither a criminal trial, it's more of a political trial. And as most of us all know, politically, it's going to end up a different way than perhaps either a criminal trial or a regular trial would end up. I think the facts have been laid out pretty well, but the politics of it all shows that we're still very, very divided. And obviously, many of the Republicans, not all, but many of them are scared to death of that base that some of whom were part of the riot. And I guess what disturbs me most is, how do we get out of all of this? How do we heal all of this? I mean, lives, it cannot happen again, but how do we hold people accountable? I'm not sure we're holding politicians accountable. I'm not sure we're even holding the rioters accountable, at least yet. It's disturbing, but how it can come to a positive end, I'm not so sure.
Well, the Valentine's symbol is the heart. And, it is heartbreaking to think that our country had come to such a point. I think is probably breaking God's heart that we would treat each other as objects in that way. There's a human reality here that strikes me, that the members of Congress seem to have come to a place of moral outrage only when they themselves were attacked. And this is normal for human beings. It's compassion for others in other places is a bigger leap. But this wasn't the first time that our former president seemed to wink a bit, more than just a little bit, at misbehavior. I guess for me, even if there's a political element, even if there's a constitutional element, even if there's even a legal element about what incitement means, doesn't matter that much to me right now. What really matters to me is that for the historical record, this effort is being made to lay out what happened, the time sequence, who knew what, when, all of that. It's valuable that we have that so that for years to come, we can try to figure out how our nation could come to such a point, and that the easy excuses that we might be tempted to make for ourselves and for others won't be so easy now because of these presentations. And I think that's morally worthwhile. The truth is freeing. To coin a phrase that was coined for us already.
Dr. Taylor, thanks for sharing that. In agreement with some of those thoughts, as I thought through what's going on this week, one of the things that really struck me is that I think on both sides, people's politics are starting to drive their morality. That's one of the things I'm observing happening. The right, many on the right were part of this fueling what happened at the Capitol, and people justifying this based on their politics. But, we saw the same thing on the left. In the summer, we saw federal buildings demolished and attacked. We saw, CHOP or Chaz set up, and we saw rape and murder. And we saw the left pretty quiet about what was going on. And I hope I'm implicating both sides with this, that it seems to be when it's our cause, we can not give the moral weight to what really happened. And I think sincerely, I've seen both sides do that. And I think there's been some moral desensitizing that we're a little inoculated to what's going on, because with politics, we've tried to make everything a moral outrage. We saw this is, of course, the second attempt at impeaching Donald Trump, whether that's right or wrong. We've seen everything has been an outrage. And so it gets harder to say, man, this really is morally outrageous. So I am concerned that we have less moral certitude, and truth is becoming more difficult to ascertain because of how we're often letting our politics lead the way.
Yeah, the one thing I would want to add to that is just how unique the president is. We need a president who doesn't weigh in that same way that you just described. That we want a president who can be a bit above some of that human behavior, that regrettable human behavior that you were describing, because the power is just unthinkably enormous. So that my hope and my prayer is that one of the lessons and takeaways from all this is for people who run for public office to see what that power can lead to and to rein themselves in.
I can remember a lot of presidential speeches and remarks, but I cannot remember for the life of me any president of the United States in the history of this country who has exhorted any group of people, any audience, to go up there and fight like hell. And that's a new low as far as I'm concerned. Fight like hell.
Again, I want to go back to David's point that I think we're the moral side of the news, and we come from various traditions, Christian and Jewish, that has a moral component to it. And of course, unfortunately for all of us here, when you start to speak about moral implications, everybody sometimes, oh, you're getting partisan now, Father, or, you can't talk about that. Well, I think we've got to be above liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat, and say, what are the moral issues of truth, honesty, respect for others, compassion, respectful of differences? And I think you're right. I think we have lost a sense of balance in all of that. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us in our religious traditions to say, we've got to recapture that a bit and say, okay, whether you're Democrat or Republican, we all make mistakes. We're all sinners. We all make poor judgments sometimes, but what's the right thing to do for the right reason, aside from your politics? Now, politics has moral implications. I think we forget that a lot of times, and our choices have moral implications. But how to get right from wrong really clear, I really feel badly for a lot of our kids who are watching all of this and watching sometimes the hypocrisy on all sides. Say one thing, do another. Kids are watching that and saying, well, you're telling me this is what I'm supposed to do, but I watch this person, that person is doing exactly the opposite of that. Isn't that okay? I don't know how we hold people accountable and say, no, if you do this, there are consequences to your actions. But I think you've nailed it there.
Following up with another question about this, when the trial is come and gone and whatever the outcome happens to be, what do you think as a country will learn from that? What will it teach us? What will it tell us?
There are probably a lot of things. I'll just jump in quickly because I thought it was very intriguing, this idea of a January exception, that somehow there'd be a different standard for the last month in office. And I hope one of the things that, we walk away with is, as long as you're president, your behavior matters. And it had never occurred to me that wouldn't be true for your last month in office. But I realize that's a kind of a low level learning from all of this, but it was a new thought for me to think that there could be something like a January exception for a president. I don't think there should be.
I think, again, one of the things we might learn is from what David said. We've had, obviously, disturbances this summer, Black Lives Matter, and some people on one political party were blasting that as they're just rioters, they're all that kind of stuff. Then we have this incident in January of a different political persuasion, and somehow there's some inconsistency here. We do have a right to protest. I have no question about that, peacefully. And I think some people on both of those sides probably did so peacefully. But it's always dangerous because there's a tipping point at which anger turns into violence. And that's where both arguments fall apart. Stan.
I'm going to harp on a verse from Leviticus that I've been harping on for months, and everyone on the panel knows it. In the Hebrew, it's V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. We need to, through this terrifying and horrid experience of the insurrection and everything that's going on now, we need to relearn to love our neighbor as ourselves, because we're all people created in the image and likeness of God. And the interesting thing about that rather brief verse is there's no adjective there. It doesn't say love your liberal neighbor as yourself, or love your conservative neighbor as yourself, or love your Democratic neighbor as yourself, or your Republican neighbor as yourself. It is unequivocal. Love your neighbor as yourself. And hopefully we can teach the people who have just gone for whatever reason, over the edge to come back from the precipice and work together for a United States of America.
Rabbi Miles, I appreciate that. Yes, I think this concept of love your neighbor is a reminder that what we're seeing is, a trickle down from moral decay, from a lot of problems across the board in our country. These are sort of symptoms and flare-ups of, I think, deeper issues that we're seeing, again, just in a lot of areas, in breakdown of family life, breakdown of decency and neighborly care. We're watching this as a result of, I think, a lack of moral absolutes. And again, I think that the solution is not necessarily going to come from the top down. I think neighbors are going to have to love neighbors. People are going to have to return to some sort of moral foundation and belief systems that we share in common to move forward. So I do appreciate that this is going to be something that every single person is going to have to participate in.
John, there's one other thing I was thinking about, because that there's to me a little danger in acting like there's some sort of equivalency between the social unrest and demonstrations last summer versus what happened around the elections. Not to minimize, you should not destroy people's property. You should not harm people physically. You should not, in a prolonged way, keep people from earning a living. All those things are true. But one of the takeaways from this past year, I hope, will be that if we really undermine elections and undermine the process of certifying votes, that we are undermining something unique, something that holds us together as a nation. And so the process of acting like the election wasn't legitimate even before people were voting, and then making stuff up about what happened at the polls, and then trying to get people to influence the certification process itself on January 6th. That's different. That's new. That endangers the whole country, not just the people in a particular town who've gotten caught up in a demonstration. I grew up with a little bit of a civics textbook naivete about our government. I'll admit that. I wasn't even cured of it by doing a PhD in political science. I want to believe that in our elections, and I want to step back and let our leaders do what we've authorized them to do in certifying elections. So I just hope that the result of all this isn't an increased cynicism about those democratic institutions, but rather the opposite, an acknowledgement that they are vulnerable but extremely precious. Yeah.
That's a really good point, Marian. And one of the things that's been a blessing I saw in this is so a lot of those election officials, all those people that work so hard on the elections, I think we've taken them for granted in so many different ways. The hours they had to spend, and a lot of the election officials were both Democrat or Republican, and they did their jobs well, even though they've taken incredible abuse for doing a good job. But maybe that goes back to what Stan just said. Stan, last week I was in a Zoom meeting, and a rabbi from another city was using that same example of Leviticus 19, and he went through the whole chapter, which I hadn't done in a while, and saying how much more than just love your neighbor as yourself, the specific statements of how you do that, which I'm afraid we Christians have sometimes only read the one verse and forgot the rest of the verses, which really do specify loving your neighbor as yourself means how you treat widows, orphans, and I think this goes back to the root of both problems, as Marian just said. There are social ills that people were protesting last summer. even given the benefit of the doubt to the rioters in Washington, they're frustrated by some problems that they don't feel are being recognized in their communities. And some of those might be legitimate, that we're not solving things. Now, violence is not the way to solve it, but we've really got to have a conversation more and more about how do we listen and how do we solve problems.
All right, we have a second topic on our program, Moral Side of the News, and we have about 10 minutes left in the program, so let's move on to it. A resolution was filed in the Kentucky House of Representatives this week to declare systemic racism a public health and safety crisis in Kentucky. This follows the lead of similar resolutions passed in the cities of Louisville and Lexington. The resolution states the General Assembly would declare racism a crisis affecting the well-being of our state. So we turn to our panel on Moral Side of the News. And panelists, two questions. Is racism a public health crisis? And do you think measures like this will offer solutions?
I definitely think that racism is a public health crisis on several levels. I think the most immediate is one that I dare say that most of us don't think about because we don't live in the west end of Louisville. And that is, if you live in that neighborhood, you do not have access to food. It's a food desert. I mean, if I need food, it's 5 minutes in one direction to Kroger and the other 5 minutes in the other direction to Costco. And in the west end of Louisville, you don't have access to a Kroger or a Costco, which means your options either are not there at all, or they're not there at all, or they're more expensive than those of us who live in other neighborhoods. And is it a public health crisis? Yes. When parents of African American children, when they become adolescents, have to give them, and this is in quotes, the talk. There are certain things that they should do, certain things that they should not do to protect their lives. And this whole thing was driven home to me a couple of years ago when Reverend Kevin Cosby was detained by a policeman and totally degraded by that policeman just because he was an African American driving a brand and model of car that the policeman thought was rather unusual for an African American to be driving. Is it a public health crisis? Yes, it's a public health crisis, both physical health and mental health.
I think there is something to the idea that it is a health crisis. I guess I'm a little concerned that too often when we hear racism, we hear black and white only. And I mean, I think it's black, white, brown, purple, polka dot, whatever. I mean, anti-Semitism is a type of racism. Xenophobia, I mean, all the isms. And so I'm a little concerned about maybe we needed to use a different word than racism. And I'm not sure what the word is. I mean, I think there's a reality there, but I think it starts to get people into certain categories that they don't see any of the rest of it. And that's probably one of my concerns. And we think of health only as physical health rather than mental health sometimes. And so there's some concerns about it that it's going to get twisted and misinterpreted.
If I may jump in, I certainly think that there is a public health crisis with race, and I think there's a lot of issues we could talk about. I think the most pressing and the most avoided is that an incredible number of our minorities are facing issues with abortion in their communities. I spent some time on the CDC website today and yesterday, and I was reading some congressional policy reports. And if I did my math right, it looked like 33% of Black children, that'd be a shocking statistic if I calculated right, are aborted. That was 2017. Abortion statistics run a few years behind. But make no mistake, we have taxpayer dollars supporting Planned Parenthood that unquestionably targets minority communities. It's on the CDC website. It's on congress.gov. You can find this information. But, for me, that's the thing that we don't want to talk about. But that's an absolute crisis of health that's race related.
I'll just jump in with another dimension of this. I think it's great that a topic like this gets put officially on the table for discussion so that we can hear each other out about it. I do think there's an awful lot of stress in life that is bad for one's health if one lives in fear of being discriminated against or yelled at or whatever. Some of those things are very harmful to health. There's also a lot of history here about experiments and healthcare systems being skewed one way or another. Even disease research sometimes has focused on the white male instead of on women or on minorities. So there's a whole lot to unpack here. And sometimes if you don't just get a bold idea out there and then start having hearings, that's the way to get to the bottom of things. So I'm hopeful that we'll have a good learning experience and a good debate about it.
Any other thoughts on this topic, as we have about 2 minutes left on our program today?
So some of this is very indirect. I'll just add this other thing. Now that the vaccination is being prioritized for K through 12 teachers, then you look at the underrepresentation of minorities in the public school system. And so who's getting the shots? White people. Why? Because minorities are not represented well among the teachers. And so you start to see how the concatenation of factors, it can look totally innocent, well, they should be teachers, then they'd get the shot. But then you find out a whole myriad of underlying problems that keep minorities from becoming teachers. I just think there's a lot to unpack.
Transportation is another one. If you got a car, you can get a vaccine much easier than if you don't have a car. Trying trust bus and all that kind of stuff. So the poor, whatever the category they might be, are disproportionately not able to get shots, unfortunately.
Well, Father Joe Graffis, you have the final word on this edition of our program, Moral Side of the News. Thanks to our panel, Dr. Marian Taylor, Rabbi Emeritus Stan Miles, Father Joe Graffis, and we welcome again Reverend David Harkleroad.
Yes.
Thank you, panel, for being part of this program, and thanks to our viewers and listeners. We'll be back again next week with another edition of Moral Side of the News. Until next week, so long.